Erica Komisar, welcome back to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me, John.
So, you have been the surprise hit on our channel.
Thank you.
Not surprised because your ideas aren't great, but just surprised because we're a show that talks to a lot of guys, and you have resonated in a lot of interesting ways, and I want to dig in deeper together on a bunch of fronts. And the place I want to start and get your take on is the psychological crisis that's happening with our boys. Because there does seem to be something going on, and I've seen it with some of our some other interviews we've done in the past year, where there is an anger, there is a brokenness, and it has shaded into some behavior that is frankly kind of contemptible, even in the comments, frankly.
Mhm.
And I'm curious your perspective as a psychotherapist and someone that's trying to help people with this mental health disaster. How do you understand what's going on with boys, especially Gen Z boys? Because there's some bad stuff going on.
Well, first define bad stuff.
Well, let me start with, I think, a reactionary tendency among a subset who are struggling and have become anti-woman
hmm
in the extreme.
hmm
It's one thing to be against the excesses of feminism. It's another thing to become, frankly, just a woman hater.
hmm hmm
The relationship collapse. Slate just had an article about situationships and the collapse of romantic relationships among
hmm
young people, and it's really extreme. So the dating apps is a part of that, but I don't think it's the only thing going on. But if you aren't getting a chance to have girlfriends, if you're not getting to have the experiences of adolescence and young adulthood that give rise to being a full person,
hmm
and then you are in this world that has been very woke and has been telling you that the future is female, and there's a lot of things that can trigger resentment, but how you respond to that is still your own choice. So that's what, when I say brokenness and bad stuff, that's what I'm talking about. People who are, instead of finding a way to have energy and have forward momentum, are
hmm
turning inward and and embracing a certain kind of victimhood that's self-defeating and
hmm
negative, and then going into online spirals. The popularity of the worst aspects of Andrew Tate is another example of
hmm
this.
hmm
There will be people in the comment who are just angry that you are going to answer this question being a woman at all.
hmm hmm
How dare you? So how are you? I've
Well,
set the table as best I can.
I like to think of myself rather than being a woman as being a therapist. How about that?
I
Um,
agree.
so, what I would say is, I've spoken to you on your show before about how we diminished motherhood and women, but interestingly, we've also diminished boys and men and masculinity. And so you could say that everything's sort of out of balance. And so I think that this is all a product of it being out of balance. When we empowered women, which was the right thing to do because women were disempowered at some point in history. So we said, right, we got to empower women. So we empowered women. And then women have overshot the mark, you could say, and left men behind in many ways. 60% of students in university are men.
Or
In
women.
graduate schools, are
Yep.
women. Also in graduate schools are women. And so I think men feel left behind. They feel disenfranchised. We know that the statistics say that men will marry at their educational level or below, and women will marry at their educational level or above, which
Which
means that men are not good enough for women anymore. And there's an attitude amongst women that is, in trying to become competitive with men, became adversarial with men. So we say, instead of thinking of men as partners, we then became adversaries with men. So, and that destroyed the team aspect of relationships. It destroyed the balance. So I'm going to use an example, which is,
Please.
my 5-year-old son, when he was 5, he's 25 now. We were going to a conference in Aspen, and he had to go through Denver, and Denver airport is really long. And so we said to our son, the connection's really kind of close. So you've got to run, Bryce, run. And so we all started running. I was running with the baby, and Bryce was running. My husband was running. And so we get to the gate just as the gate is closing, and we're all there except for Bryce, because Bryce kept running. And he was at the end of Denver airport. So my husband put his foot in the door and ran after Bryce and brought him back. My point is that in empowering women was a good thing, but women kept running and men got left behind. And this is not a good thing for society, that the balance of universities and graduate schools is off. If you look at nursery schools or pre-K, they balance their classroom, 50% boys and 50% girls. Why aren't we doing that? And so, the diminishing of boys has left boys behind, but it's also affected their self-esteem. It's affected their feelings of, interestingly, their feelings of adequacy. And so they're in their bedrooms playing video games, not feeling they're good enough or capable of reaching out to these women. I'm going to use another example. Another son, 23-year-old son now, he went to a club recently in New York, and he said, I have a lot of good stories. He said that, Mom, all the women my age were so put together and so professional. And I'm just standing there in my, my jeans and my t-shirt, and they all looked so together. And I said to him, the deal is that women have always matured before men.
Yeah.
And that's not really unusual. So a 23-year-old woman might look more put together and have better executive functioning than a 23-year-old young man. But that was expectable. Now, those young men take it as, I shouldn't even try. They're not going to give me a shot. So really the balance is off. We have to rebalance society. I hate to say it, but maybe the idea of quotas and rebalancing classes, and it would be a really good thing, because that anger is anger about being left behind.
All right, real quick. If you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It lets YouTube know that you want to see more Dad Saves America, and it helps spread the word. So it's one of the best things you can do to support what we're doing. And now, back to the show. What is happening? And obviously, you can't talk about it, patience in any kind of detail, but have you experienced this generically? Like, what is happening with someone who comes to you who's grappling with this, who's got anger, who's got a feeling of the world is against them, some of which justifiably, but even so, it's not productive. Like, how do you work with that person? What are the steps you take to get them to start to be productive, to start to be able to take the steps out of the hole?
Well,
Psychologically.
some of it's about self-esteem. You just start at the cornerstone of a person, which is their self-esteem, right? If a boy is told from the time he's really small, so let's go back to the origins, because I'm an origin person, because psychoanalysts are all origin people, and talk about that the self is founded from the very beginning, from the first 3 years and onward, with the concept that boys and girls are not the same. They've never been the same. Biologically, we're different. Hormonally, we're different. Energetically, we're different. Little boys produce tons of testosterone when they're little, and it makes them very energetic, and it makes them more distractible and a little harder to manage. And that's what testosterone does. And they're being punished because they're being held to a standard when they're really little of little girls, who mostly can sit quietly in circle time and learn in a different way. And so they're being labeled and marginalized and punished. And once they have that label that they're a problem, they have behavioral problems, or, then that follows them into the primary school years, into the middle school years, into the high school years. So, first we are not understanding little boys are different than little girls. And then from the beginning, labeling and criticizing and marginalizing them. And that's the beginning of the problem.
Is
And
that partly because the education system is so slanted towards women that it's something like 8 out of 10 K through 12 teachers are women? And I
absolutely.
think it might even be more extreme than that when you talk about like the early ages.
Absolutely. I mean, it's geared towards girls because girls learn differently than boys. So, I always say that it's better to separate girls and boys in the early years and then bring them back together when they're more kind of interested sexually. But, in the early years, they really learn differently. Little boys need 4 recess periods a day. They need to be able to run to get their energy out. Otherwise, they can't learn. So the best for boys would be that in boys' schools, they understand this. So in boys' schools, they have a recess period, and then they have half an hour of learning. And then they have another recess period, and they have a half an hour of learning.
You have to run them like puppies.
Yes, like puppies. Whereas with girls, you can give them 1 recess period a day and they can sit for longer periods of time in circle time. And so we basically have geared our whole educational system towards the way girls learn. And of course, girls are going to be more successful in an environment that's the way girls learn. Now, by the way, girls would also benefit from more physical exercise and more getting your energy out, right? So everyone benefits from that, but definitely boys benefit from that more.
One of the questions I have about that, and I'm curious if you've got a sense of what's changed, is the school experience hasn't changed mechanically that much in the past 50 years. But the change in the performance and outcome of boys versus girls has changed somewhat relatively recently. So do you have a sense of what has triggered the shift? Because for my generation as a Gen Xer, I went all through the same stuff. It was like I didn't like school when I was little and I wanted to run around and the girls were better than the boys at school. But then actually it would tend to flip in high school and then the boys would perform better.
Yeah.
And through for whatever reason. But that's something broke and it's broken more recently than any changes I can understand to school. But maybe I mean school's gotten different in ways that matter, but it doesn't seem like the female concentration or the lack of physical activities has changed that much. But maybe I'm wrong. Like, how do you understand that?
No, it has changed. So what happened is we went more towards cognitive-based learning at a very young age instead of play-based learning. So, preschool, which used to be called nursery school, was purely play-based. In my day, I'm 60, so we had 1 year of preschool. You were 4, and you went for 2 hours a day and you just played. And then in kindergarten, you just played. The garden of children, kindergarten, you just
right.
played.
Yeah.
It wasn't even that structured. And so,
Now they do worksheets, they get
yeah,
homework.
exactly.
It sucks.
And you're supposed to know how to read by the time you enter kindergarten and know your letters. And so what they're doing is they're cramming cognitive learning into these little children who some of them can accommodate, but there's always a consequence, right? And so the consequence for little boys is they're developing stress disorders because you're forcing little boys to learn in ways that they're not prepared to learn yet. And they develop these stress disorders. Like they'll develop distractibility. It's the flight part of fight or flight. They'll develop behavioral problems. That's the aggression, the fight part. And so little girls aren't so all the research says that little boys are more sensitive. So we say that more little boys are born in the world and more little girls survive. And that has to do with the sensitivity, both physical and emotional and neurological sensitivity of little boys.
More little boys are born and more little girls survive.
Survive.
Help me understand what that means. Because obviously, like the literally 50-50 birth rate for boys and girls.
If
So what
you
does that mean?
look worldwide, more boys are born in the world, but they don't survive. And the reason they don't survive is because they're much more susceptible to physical and emotional stress.
So they're literally dying.
They
more
literally
frequently.
die. Yeah, there's more infant mortality with boys than with girls. Boys are more neurologically fragile. It's why there's a higher incidence of autism in boys, right? So there's lots of research to show that
Really?
some of the rise in autism has to do with cortisol in utero. That's some of the research that's going on. But basically, boys are more susceptible to stress. And so they're more likely to develop a lot of these symptoms that we're seeing. So we've put the screws on in school in both boys and girls, but boys are more susceptible.
I encountered this on a personal level, and it changed the way I approached education for my son before I was reading about it. And that was the kindergarten thing. So I
Mhm.
lived in Verona, New Jersey. My son went to the kindergarten at Our Lady of the Lake, and it was rigorous, and he was
Yeah.
getting homework, and he hated it. And I went to the principal. I've told this story several times. And I asked her, I said, am I missing something? Didn't it used to just be play? She said, yes. I'm like, wasn't that better? She's like, yes. I said, well, why are you doing this? This is your school. And she said, the parents demand we keep up with the standards of the public school because it was a
That's
Catholic
right.
school. And they want us to see we're reading the benchmarks of the rigor of the standardized testing. And so when we moved to Austin, we put our son in a Waldorf school, which is like the opposite. They're not even expecting you to read until third grade. So it was a much slower ramp. And he thrived in that. But I didn't know why that. I didn't know why it felt wrong. It just felt wrong. I could just see the discomfort. He would scream at the top of his lungs to go to kindergarten.
Yeah. So it starts young. We know that this kind of diminishing and demeaning and criticizing of little boys starts young. So you could say that all of this sort of masculinity hating that's happening now, toxic masculinity and masculinity hating, is starts very young. And so you asked why young men. So to sort of bring it up to speed, why young men feel so angry at women. And I think it's because of the culture that we've created, which is instead of helping men and women to see that it's a team approach, that romantic relationships are a team approach, that it's okay to be different. We've created competition and adversarial relationships. And I think in many cases, because women have been idealized today and men have been diminished and demeaned, they resent the women, and so I think we've done this to society. I think it's imbalanced. I think we have to create balance again.
One of the things that I hadn't thought about until recently was that Gen Z came into middle school, high school against the backdrop of the Me Too
Oh,
movement.
absolutely.
Had and I haven't grappled with that. Another guest had brought it up, and it was striking. It was like, wow, that was happening. And at the same time, they also have these screens that are delivering all the culture news 24/7 to them. So they're experiencing the rhetoric of the Me Too movement, which had some things that were important, but obviously went too far in other places. Well, I'm curious, how do you understand what that moment did for sex relations at this earlier age? It's one thing to be in the workplace, but I mean
Yeah.
for our kids who are trying to get the courage to ask the girl to the prom
Yeah.
and being told, are you gonna are you're part of culture and things
Yeah.
like how do you understand what's happened there?
Well, they're frightened of women. I mean, young men are frightened of women. They're frightened of the power that women have to accuse them of. So I mean, I think again, to look at it in a balanced way is to say, and a more objective way is to say that at some point society idealized men and diminished women. It needed to be balanced, but in trying to balance it, we imbalanced it. It's the way, right? The pendulum swings from one side to the other. Women used to resent men because they were misogynistic, and now men resent women because they have so much power over young men, and young men are afraid. Quite frankly, the young men who come to see me are afraid of women. Either they're afraid that women are going to reject them because, as my son said, they all seem so together, and they're all looking for, someone who's as together and can make lots of money, because we've also become a very material culture. So the idea that women will marry only at their level or above is also socioeconomically.
Oh yeah, for sure. You got to be
Yeah,
taller. You got to be looking. I
Right.
mean, my son has talked about this. He said the expectations even at high school age are super extreme.
Yeah.
It's
And
like you're looking
perfectionistic.
for this idealized thing, and the swipe apps allow you to just filter until you find somebody that looks like they meet this narrow criteria. And then the way that distributes is also crazy. Like the percentage of candidates that get swiped in the affirmative male to female is totally different. And
Yep.
so it's like we've got a lot more men being rejected and a lot more. So there's all these other things going on.
Well, remember what I said about boys being more fragile. They're more neurologically and emotionally fragile. Always were. It's just the way of biology. They always have been. And so when you take away their identity and you tell them that being boys and being masculine is bad and they're bad, and they're toxic, and then you've basically robbed them of some of their confidence, some of their identity, and then they're afraid of what women can do to them, what young women can do to them. So it's a power imbalance, really. Men and women should share power always. Relationships are meant to be partnerships, meant to be teamwork. You don't generally have two CEOs. It doesn't generally work. You have a CEO, you have a CFO, you have a head of marketing, right? In any company, you have different roles that people play. We're not the same. We have different roles we play. We're a team. And so that idea has been exchanged for this idea of competition to be the same. So interestingly, when women were empowered, they didn't become better women, more like the best women they could be. They became like men, right?
Even
But
in the culture,
then,
we've seen this, right? The superhero, the female superheroes are like a copy and paste job.
right.
It's like now you can beat up the giant Russian agents. And I'm not saying that's always bad. I mean, we've had great female superhero characters, but there is a kind of like thoughtless, yeah, copy and paste
Copy
going
and
on.
paste, right? So I'm going to outdo men. I'm going to be a better man than a man. And so what that diminished again is the yin and the yang, the sort of the team approach with two different genders that each had important, very important roles to play in society, in the workplace, so the idea that you can be equal in intelligence and ambition, but be different too. And that's all been diminished.
I I've been playing around with something that's a really simple way to think about some of this, and not probably all that unique, but it seems like we had, I call it like the cultural bell curve. We had this natural order of things as tribal creatures, was that if you sort of say like along the horizontal axis is behavior and the vertical is social acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
There was a certain set of behaviors that were accepted, and if you weren't in the tribe and if you didn't obey the rules of the tribe, you were thrown off. It looked like a building. It was like
Mm-hmm.
flat at the top, or maybe graduated, like but then steep fall off.
Mm-hmm.
And in response to that steep fall off and the total rejection of anything that wasn't inside of what's normal, came, I think, a well-intended desire to say no. The ideal state is flat. All behaviors are equal, except not just acceptable, but there is no differences between any of us, between men and women, between people of different capabilities. Nope, it's this sort of blank slate vision of humanity. And then the problem with that was that, well, the blank slate, except if you're a certain unacceptable, deplorable type, and then off the side you go.
Right.
And in reality, we've got this uncomfortable thing we have to face, that is what I'm hearing you say, which is behaviors distribute in certain ways that are just natural and are different, and there is masculinity and femininity. They're not in two different worlds, but they are different. To try to flatten that doesn't produce utopia. It produces a lot of social problems, it is like one step forward, three steps back. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, so Freud said that there's masculinity and femininity in everyone, but he didn't, it's always misinterpreted that people say, well, that means everybody's bisexual, and that's not exactly what he meant. He meant that we all have masculine and feminine characteristics, just like we all have estrogen and testosterone. We all have oxytocin and, and vasopressin. There's different hormones that we have, but to varying degrees. I mean, men have much more vasopressin, what we call the protective aggressive hormone. Women have more oxytocin, the sensitive nurturing, empathic nurturing hormone. Men produce oxytocin too, to a lesser degree, and when they produce it, it has a different behavior associated with it. It's more playful tactile stimulation with children, not sensitive empathic nurturing. So there are just differences, and there have always been, to a varying degree, for instance, maybe a woman would have masculine characteristics, but she'd still have more feminine ones. A man might have some feminine characteristics, but still more masculine ones. And I think what we've done is we've taken that away. And we've said that, women have to be 50% masculine or 80% masculine. Men, to be accepted in society as metrosexual, or have to be 80% feminine. And so, we're not allowing for the differences. And I think that's really, it's sad for society. It's troubling doing what I do in terms of parenting and seeing how children in this whole paradigm are the ones who are the losers. They're abandoned, because if you have two people vying for the same role of being masculine, then you have nobody who's vying for the role of being feminine. So some fathers are vying for the role of being feminine, staying home with their kids. It's possible. But for the most part, what we have is a society that's become very masculine. But women are becoming more masculine than men, and that's pissing off men.
It's an interesting way to think about it. It's like we're becoming more of the worst kind of masculine.
That's right. Right.
Not a healthy masculinity.
The healthy part of masculinity was the protective aggressive part. I think I mentioned this on your last show, but for anyone who doesn't remember it, I'll mention it again. There was a study done where mother and father lay in bed together, and the baby cries. And when the baby cries, the mother wakes up because she's very vigilant to the distress of the baby. The father sleeps through the baby's cries. As soon as there's rustling of leaves outside the window, the father wakes up and the mother sleeps through it. Why? Because the father is sensitive to predatorial threat. So what was the good part of masculinity? Being protective. It was protective, aggressive nature to protect your family. A father lion on the plains of Africa is going to protect his group, right? So that was the good part of masculinity. And what we've done is we've taken that away from men. Women say, I don't need you. And, what's interesting is this election where Trump got up and said, I'm going to protect you. And all of the feminist women said, I don't need protection. What do you mean? And the truth is that, he wasn't eloquent in saying it, but there was an aspect of masculinity that was, I'm the daddy of the family. I'm going to protect my young. I'm going to protect my partner who's protecting my young. A team exercise. Whereas today, women are getting angry about that. They're resenting it. And so it leaves men identityless. It leaves them not knowing who they're supposed to be. Their hormones tell them to do one thing, but now women in society are telling them to do something else. It's both confusing and it strips men of their essential identity. By the way, it also strips women of their identity, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because immigration is such a big issue this year, and not just in the U.S. and Western Europe, and I'm a right of center guy, but I am more pro-immigration on average probably than, even my viewers. They know
I think
that.
you and I are sort of in the same place. Yeah.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah,
right of center, but still have liberal values. Yeah.
Yeah, properly understood.
Yeah.
Human dignity, universal human dignity.
Yes.
And I think that one of the things that has sort of push to the macro scale is exactly what you're talking about. The destabilizing force, the sense of an actual foreign aggressor,
Mm-hmm.
and that the president saying, I will protect you, like it's primordial, the sense in which that connected with people, I think. Not just
Protective aggressive. It was like, what happened to this? This was part of our evolutionary sort of way of being for millennium, for thousands of years. And what happened to it in just 75 years? You can't turn around evolution in 75 years. It doesn't work like that, right? So
now, how do you, well, I have two questions. Let me start with the why. It's easy to say we as the society is very socializing, like definitionally, of responsibility. Why did this happen this way? How do you understand the causal forces? Is it whacked out academics taking things to the extreme and overtaking the academia? Like, it isn't like we all woke up and had a different way of thinking about this stuff. There are players and institutions and forces that have made this happen. So why? How do you understand what's taken place?
well, again, I benefited from the feminist movement, but I would say the feminist movement was a little bit misdirected in its telling women that they should become more like men. Because from the beginning, they should have said, men and women are equally important to society. And you have a right to have choices. If you don't want to get married and have children, you should have that choice. You should have that choice to be out in the work world or to work, or, but it didn't, it undermined the differences between men and women. And that was the beginning of it, right? And so, as soon as we undermine the differences, so again, women became more like men. And then men were expected to become more like women. But it seems to me that women slipped into the role of masculinity more easily than men slipped into the role of femininity. And there's a reason, I think, for it, which is that what was expected of men for millennium is that they were the aggressors, right?
Yeah.
They also had to perform, right? You have to perform sexually. Women don't have to perform sexually. Men have to perform sexually. That involves aggression. There's an aggressive, so we call it primal scene when children walk in on their parents having sex, because children perceive of
Freud
it.
stuff now.
Yeah, children perceive of it as aggressive. They get scared of it because it looks like daddy's doing something terrible to mommy. And the truth is, it's an aggressive act. It's a loving aggressive act in most cases, unless it's rape. It's a loving aggressive, but it is an aggressive act. So men were always the aggressors. It was expected that men would step forward, ask women out, that men would take the initiative, that men would perform sexually. And so that was a very important part of men's identity. You take that away from men, and then you have those young men sitting in their bedroom, being afraid to be the aggressors, being afraid to take the initiation with a woman. Not only that they'll reject him, but that, their masculinity being diminished, they won't be able to perform. I can't tell you how many young men are on ED medication.
I was just thinking this. It was the next question I was going to ask. I've read about this, and it is, as an older guy, it's shocking to me that you're in your 20s and you're going to struggle to get an erection.
Well, there are websites now to provide medications online. I won't name them, but it's because there's such a demand. I have a psychiatrist I refer young men to who specifically deals with the emotional aspects of ED. It's not physical. You could say it's organic because, the emotions affect one's physical performance, but it's emotional. So again, men without their identity are lost. These young men are lost. They can't perform. And what we don't understand, and we're starting to understand because there's more research going on, when oxytocin levels go up, meaning when men are feminized, their testosterone goes down. Why? Because the investment in mammals, because we're just mammals, the investment in mammals in nurturing diminishes the investment in mating. So
Okay, yeah,
when
so
we
play this out.
nurture and become more feminine as men, I'm not a man, but your testosterone levels go down. So what's happening is there's less sex going on, and there's less good sex going on, and men are having a harder time performing, and they're needing to take these medications to perform.
Well, I understand. Is this part of the sort of the dad brain effect? So, when Warren Farrell has talked to me about this, and he writes about it in his book that, we as men, I experienced it um, when my son was born. You get rewired.
Mm-hmm.
And you do become more nurturing. You change what you are when you become a dad.
But the way that dads are nurturing, which is playful tactile
Yeah,
stimulation, resilience building, encouraging exploration, separation. So what we're finding is with these single mothers by choice, women who go out to a sperm bank and, say, I can't find a man. This is like a phenomenon. There's plenty of men around. I can't find a man to love.
Who's
Okay.
6'5" and makes 150K and
Right,
has a
right.
PhD because I have my master's.
Right. So I'm going to go to a sperm bank. Now they go to a sperm bank. They have a baby on their own. These babies can attach to the mothers, but there's no one to help with the separation because fathers were always the vehicle of separation. Mothers were the attachment object, love object. Fathers were the separation, love object. So without fathers around, babies sleep in their mother's beds for a very long time. They don't learn to separate in the same way. They don't have a model and learn how to be masculine from a masculine role model. They don't learn to regulate their aggression. And so this is a problem. But obviously, the biggest problem is that, you have little boys out there not learning to be boys and not learning to be men.
When you don't find any role models in school, so this is the sort of terrifying feedback loop of leaving the world in fatherlessness, right? It's like so you have fatherlessness. It creates this imbalanced, psychologically fragile, broken situation that then repeats itself because now you're a worse mate. So you're getting shunted off into incel territory.
That's right. Because if you're, again, incel territory is limbo. It's purgatory. It's neither here nor there. That's really what it is. You're not a girl, but you don't feel like a boy. I mean, people that listen to this are going to get upset with that, but that is the truth. Because we're not allowing boys to be boys, not awful boys, not toxic masculinity, just protective, aggressive, taking initiative, allowing boys to be masculine and not punishing them for it. So they're feeling they can't go there, but they're not really girls. So they're stuck in their rooms in purgatory.
You have boys, and this is your work. One of the things that I found myself with my son, and he's doing pretty well. He's got a girlfriend, he's at school. It's his freshman year, so he's struggling a little bit, but that's okay. I found myself in a very weird spot as a father, and which was he had girls he liked who liked him.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself saying, well, you have to make the first move. You want, you're going to be in the friend zone. And I'm saying these things that are like probably just like now they're like cringe dad sayings from a former time, the friend zone. But the response I would get from him is, you don't understand. Like, I can't just do that. I can't just make the move.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'm asking myself, am I encouraging my son to do things that will get him in trouble? Like, make the first move? Like, well, you're having a great time and you're with a girl. There's something where you will know. You can grab her and kiss her. like you're at the movies and you make moves. And there's this reticence that I don't know as a father how to guide in our times, how to give good advice that's going to work, that's going to be helpful, and that isn't setting them up to be perceived as excessively aggressive. And it was really very difficult. What's your advice for that? Because I got to imagine you're encountering this even with your sons.
You have to have good radar as a boy that you stay away from paranoid, persecuted girls. There's a lot of girls out there who are not mentally well. There's a lot of boys now who are not mentally well. I mean, that's what I run around the world talking about,
Yeah.
how we're dealing with a mental illness crisis in adolescents, right? And children. But you have to have a good sense. And where do you learn that sense? By having healthy parents who love each other, who have a deeply connected relationship with you, and who you model after. That's really where you learn it. So our kids aren't learning it, right? But the idea is that you have to have a good radar for when girls are not well, when they might be paranoid, persecuted, versus a girl who's balanced and healthy and is not afraid of both her masculine and feminine parts, but is not afraid of her feminine parts. I'm going to say that. So you have to, if you want to teach your son something, it's choose emotionally healthy girls.
So if I am watching this and I don't have good role models, but I know that I want to improve myself, and I found this show and I'm like, I'm going to listen to this and let me see if I can get what, how do I start to help myself develop that skill when it hasn't been modeled by my parents and I don't have good role models out there on the screens?
So our society is so extreme in the conversation. So to tell your son or for yourself to listen to this and say, I'm going to make the first move. Now, making the first move might be asking a woman out to dinner or kissing her, which is not and is not forcing yourself on her. So, we don't understand nuance anymore. There's no nuance. And I think that's part of it, is that, a girl can say, oh, he raped me when he tried to kiss her and hug her. And it's possible. But that has to be a very unhealthy girl. So again, I go back to the idea you have to be able to determine who is healthy and who isn't healthy. And you do that by not partaking of the hookup culture. So one thing that's happened to society, to Gen Zs, and also everyone that's followed, is the hookup culture. And now it's not to say in the 80s we didn't have some form of the hookup culture, right? I mean, it's not that people weren't sleeping around. It was the
Sure.
AIDS crisis. Yep. It was heterosexual. It was gay. It was everything, right? But it's gotten much worse because there's no relationship at all. So, in the
There's
80s, it was a bad thing.
situationships. There's situationships now where there's sex, but there isn't like we're actually in a relationship. It's like, well, there's some.
Tinder's headline, is "Meet the love of your night." So,
Great.
yeah. So basically, it's a culture that diminishes again relationships. So the way you don't get accused of rape by a woman is you get to know the woman. You make sure the woman is healthy. You go out to dinner with her. You befriend her. You make sure she's mentally healthy before you make advances, right? And so maybe you have to do that even more now than ever before. But that's not the culture. The culture is just hookups. And it's interesting because they call dating, what we used to call dating, was just going out to dinner with someone and getting to know them and see if you wanted to kiss them, right? That's not what the young people do. They find each other on Tinder, they go out and they sleep together. And there's no relationship building. And so it encourages mistakes. It encourages accidental experiences that are really negative. You have to know somebody to determine whether they're healthy enough to sleep with or whether you like them enough to sleep with them. So the hookup culture is an extension of this disconnection in society. And the kids are suffering from it because they're more likely to make mistakes and be accused of things if they don't know the person they're sleeping with.
One of the things that seems like it's harder is so you're saying something that makes some assumptions, which is healthy. So what does that mean? Like,
Mm.
paint a picture. I know it's not, there's not one, there's billions, but what are some markers of a healthy psychology, of a healthy personality that so I, or maybe might be easier to say what are some warning signs that it's not healthy, but give me and the viewer some tangible like traits or behaviors or things that I should be looking for and not ignoring.
Hmm.
Because sometimes we see these things and we kind of know it's wrong, but we ignore it because we like them, and then turns out like, wow, I should have listened to my gut. But our guts have gotten a little out of whack. So help me out. Help.
So adolescents' prefrontal cortex is not developed till they're 25. That's the part of their brain that we call the emotional regulation part of their brain. So all adolescents are a little wacky in terms of their judgment and their executive functioning and all kinds of things. Their impulsivity, this is part of being an adolescent and a young adult. But healthy, basically, if I were to be reductionistic, it means being emotionally balanced, being able to regulate your emotions. So, if you are a boy and take a girl out and you make the advance and you kiss her, and then she flips out and she gets enraged at you and she screams at you and she says, who are you to kiss me? And you just harassed me, right. Houston, we have a problem because this is someone who is not emotionally regulated, right? Maybe an emotionally regulated girl would say, I don't really want that. I'm not attracted to you in that way. I'd prefer just to be friends, right? So you can see someone that goes from 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. They either have a borderline personality, they have a narcissistic personality, maybe they're highly anxious, but, emotional balance, that's what I would say, the ability to regulate one's emotions.
That turn on a dime behavior is a really good indicator. That's a great shorthand.
Uh-huh.
Because it does, you can think about the people in your life who are quick to whatever, quick
Yeah.
to anger, quick to cry,
Quick to impulsivity. So also look for impulsivity. So, young people are attracted to impulsivity, but the problem is that impulsivity is often a sign, particularly extreme impulsivity is a sign that someone is imbalanced.
This concept of our our cortex formation and development going till 25.
And boys, it's longer.
Well,
girls, it's 25. I think boys, it's more like 27 or 28.
That's interesting.
Boys develop later. Yeah.
Here's what I don't understand. I remember there was an NPR story about, this is going away a little ways back, about the average age on an aircraft carrier that was 19 years old. Human beings, Homo sapiens, have been on this planet for hundreds of thousands of years, roughly in our current biological form. And the notion that we weren't really adults until 25, I don't think that was around in like 1400. I think you were 14 and you were having to do a lot of tough stuff. You had to figure it out. You don't have to go back that far to look at a 16-year-old or the 18-year-olds going off to fight in Normandy.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Please.
The reason they took advantage of those young people is because they are impulsive, because they weren't grown up. If you got an 18-year-old and you said, I'm going to give you a gun and you're going to go fight the bad guy. And they're like, yeah. You give that to a 27-year-old. They're like, I don't want to go to war. I'm going to Canada.
You're right.
So
that's true.
It was taking advantage of, there's also, in an evolutionary way, there's a reason why there are certain characteristics associated with adolescence that were beneficial to society. They were the greatest warriors. They were the most fearless. They were the most, because you become more fearful and more cautious, and you develop things like judgment, which makes you less courageous, less fearless, more fearful, all of those things. So, who would sit by the campfire and protect the camp in the middle of the night? It would be the 15 to 25-year-olds. Who are there with their spears going, yeah, I got this.
I hope someone attacks.
Yeah. So, it had a use.
Okay, that's
And
helpful.
so
Yeah,
sending those young guys to war was not unintentional, right?
right. Yeah.
So,
Disposable. We were disposable. We're excited.
right.
We're ready to climb the wall. We're ready to like go through the trench.
But you could also say that, this whole controversy about men and combat and whatever, you know, I would say that masculinity had a very positive use, which is it was very good for hunting. It was very good for protection. It has a lot of good uses. And
Building
we've
all of the
thrown the
things.
baby now. No, we've
Yeah.
thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I hate to use that expression because of the work that I do, but we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater in throwing masculinity out, which serves such an important function in society, and trying to replace it with femininity, right? Because it has a very positive use in society.
So I come to you and I want to fix myself.
Mm.
Get regulated, get into a place where I have the self-confidence to make the move,
Mhm.
to take risks, having grown up without a dad and with a lot of smothering and a lot of helicoptering or just neglect. Um, is there a protocol, or you talked about going back to the past, but for the individual, are there things that are the sort of sequencing to help rebuild those skills when they haven't been developed?
I mean, you're talking to a therapist, so of course I'm going to say therapy is the way. Um, I think for men, I think individual therapy is really important. If we're talking about for men, let's talk about for
Yeah.
grown men. I also think groups really are good for men. Um, I don't like groups for everyone. I don't think everybody should be in a group, but I've seen groups work very well for men because you know it they together they can break down the barriers of being able to be vulnerable with one another and share an experience and not feel judged. And so, yeah, men's groups are really, I think, important for men. But individual therapy, I also think with children and adolescent boys, there aren't enough male child therapists. This is actually a real problem. There aren't enough therapists in general in this country. There are 30 people in need of therapy to one therapist. That's the ratio right now. There's only one therapist available to every 30 people who wants therapy. So that statistic is pretty ridiculous, but there are not enough male child and adolescent therapists, and we need them dramatically. I mean, I mentor as many young men to go into my field as possible because little boys who don't have male role models, even if their fathers are working really hard or not really great role models, maybe they're in the family, but so they're physically there, but not emotionally there, right? So little boys need men, and then adolescent boys need men. They need male therapists, not female therapists, and so it's really tough to find. If anyone who's listening to this, if you want to go into the mental health field,
It's
male
booming. It's
child
booming.
play therapists for little boys and adolescent therapists who are male therapists is really, we don't have enough of them.
So now there is this, you are pointing to a thing that can be read in two different ways. The rise of mental health disorders in this country and the rise of therapy. One, these can go in two different currents. I mean, you'll pick up where I'm going pretty quickly, obviously. One is rising need, service providers come in. It's possible that there's a causal factor. Too much talking about our feelings, too much focusing on the negative, bad reinforcing feedback loop. This is, I think, the thesis of Abigail Schreier's book, Bad Therapy,
I know.
that you people are to blame for this.
No, actually, I'm going to correct that and say, I mean, I've heard her speak a little bit. I don't agree with everything she says, but there are a lot of bad therapists.
Well,
So
and even
I don't want to say all therapy is good therapy. You'd
yeah,
say all doctors aren't good, all lawyers aren't good, all
for sure.
podcasters aren't good.
Yep, fair.
There are a lot of bad therapists who aren't well trained, who are probably making people more ill than they are making people better. I can tell you right now that if you're going to go into therapy, you need to know who you're going into therapy with. You need to ask in the first session, what is your training? What is your education? And you need to you need to be a consumer, John. You need to know what questions to ask.
Well, this is really important because there's a couple. So, another friend and guest of the show who's here in New York, you might know him, Dr. Camilo Ortiz. He has an organization he's building, the Open Therapy Institute, and he's a cognitive behavioral guy. We've talked a lot about this, that one of the problems is now you have this massive need and you have an industry of which you are, I think, you're exceptional in this way, as I think he is, who've embraced this woke victimhood stuff and who've said that there's a lot of I go to therapy and I actually get judged. If I've heard stories of people who've said, I've gone into therapy and had the therapist, they correct me for not using the right pronouns and this kind of stuff. And it does seem like the humanities, the social sciences are dominated by this ideology in higher ed. I don't want to straw man this, but I think this is true. It's a very far left landscape. So how do and when I say far left, I'm talking most about the victimhood cult mentality, the oppressor-oppressed dynamic as a philosophy. That seems antithetical to healthy therapy. And it seems like it's dominating the industry. Jordan Peterson certainly talks about it in that way, but maybe he's being bombastic. How do you think about what's happening in your field at the educational level and then spilling out into the practitioners?
So first you have to understand that the mental health field is a very broad field. It's not one field. It's like saying Africa is a country. It's a continent, right?
Sure.
So there are many different orientations and many different aspects of the mental health field. So we could spend a whole session talking about that. What are the different categories and why do you go to one versus another? But there are very different reasons why you would go to a CBT therapist than going to a psychodynamically or psychoanalytically oriented therapist like myself. Psychoanalysts are not into they tend to be more liberal, but they're not into victim blaming because psychoanalysis is the in-depth study of a person in terms of their own responsibility as well as what has happened to them, but you'd say their internal experience and their own responsibility for their well-being. So it is not a victimizing. So you're talking about counseling. And there's a lot of people that are going around calling themselves therapists who are not well trained. And that is the problem. So if I'm going to interpret what that woman's book is saying is that therapy can hurt you if, again, you go to a bad doctor, a doctor can hurt you too, right? You have to know what to look for, what to ask for. And if you hear something in that consultation, because you should always have a consultation before you commit to a therapist that you don't like, out you go.
Do you have advice for someone who's seeking therapy to help, like a rubric for trying to evaluate that makes sense? Because looking at their credentials, most of us are gonna be like, I don't know, you went to the University of Rhode Island. I don't know if that's any good. Or like, how would I navigate that world without having to become an expert in the field myself?
So CBT therapy, we'll do a quick, just mini course. CBT therapy, I'm not a CBT therapist. CBT therapists, it was initially created for obsessive disorders, OCD, smoking cessation, symptom relief. So it was the behavioral equivalent of medication. But instead of medication, you got a little bit of talk therapy, not so much, but not so deep. They got a background, and then they helped you to deal with your symptoms.
Through exposure, right?
Yeah, so it's basically symptom relief. Now, there's good use for that. If you have OCD symptoms, if you're so highly anxious that you can't even be in an analytic process with someone like me, then going to a CBT therapist, they give you some tools, right? And so that might be good. But a lot of psychodynamic people like me also do some behavioral techniques with people who are highly anxious. The difference is that people who are psychodynamically or psychoanalytically trained is that they're trained to understand not only the present, but also how the past has influenced the present, meaning the deeper motivations and underlying causes for your illness. Because if you just keep cutting the grass grows back. You have to get the roots. You have to get to the roots of the grass. So psychodynamic psychotherapy takes a little longer. It's not just about symptom relief. The symptom relief comes as the result of understanding why you're feeling what you're feeling. And so, yeah, it's a deeper process. So asking someone, are you a CBT therapist? Are you more psychoanalytically trained or psychodynamically trained? It's kind of the same interchangeable way of saying it. And then there's other orientations too, but those are the two biggies, right? Psychiatrists generally today aren't very well trained in talk therapy. They do medication, and that's symptom relief. 50 or 75 years ago, psychiatrists a lot of them were psychoanalysts. Most of them were, meaning they were also trained to do talk therapy. Today, they are not.
So I've got these disorders. Okay, here's the pill that will help you with those disorders.
Right. And what they should say to you is, I'll medicate you, but you need to see a therapist who you can do talk therapy with. Right? If it's an OCD situation, maybe I'll refer you to a CBT therapist. But if it's a characterological issue, meaning you have trouble with attachment issues, or you're having trouble being, feeling happy in relationships and work and finding meaningful work, and, you suffer from trauma that you've never gotten over, then you go to see someone like me. Right?
Yeah. I haven't talked very much about this in the show for reasons that'll be obvious. I'm going to bring it up a little bit for context. My wife and I are in the process of, we're pretty far down the road actually on an adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a person who's in another country who has had a traumatic life.
Mm-hmm.
And adoption's fundamentally traumatic because it's separation, like everything about it. So I've had to, over the course of the past 9 months, participate in something north of 30 hours of trauma training.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been very interesting. It's been very eye-opening, but there has been a part of me that's like, how much of this is too much trauma talk? Too much, like, and maybe this is just me being a guy and being like, you know what, sometimes life's hard. And then you move forward and you don't keep dwelling on the things that were painful. They are what they are, and you move forward. The use of the word trauma in our society has become so diffuse and so overused that navigating when it's appropriate is like impossible now.
Let's talk about big T trauma versus little T trauma. Big T trauma, and I don't know, and I don't obviously want to pry or be intrusive, but big T trauma is physical abuse, severe neglect. That's big T trauma. Getting in a car accident and being crippled, or being born with a serious health, limitation, or that would be big T trauma.
Coming back from Vietnam or Iraq.
Yeah, right. PTSD, right? Big T trauma, rape, right? Having seen your parents murdered. I mean, these are big T traumas, right? Little T trauma affects more people than big T trauma. So trauma is not, the word trauma means that you have experienced something that is painful, deeply painful, relationally painful, organically painful.
You mean like leaving wounds when you say organically painful? How do you
That
mean?
might be big T trauma. But most people don't suffer from big T trauma. A lot of people do, but most people not. Most people who go to therapy suffer from little T trauma, meaning we've lost the nuance in society to understand that having a mentally ill parent, having a narcissistic parent, having a parent who has borderline personality, what we talked about earlier in the show, going up and down in terms of their emotions, having a mother who screams, or a father who loses his temper and then the next minute is fine, having an alcoholic parent that's secretive, that no one sees except is in the family, or all of these things are what I call little T trauma, meaning You know them in your heart and you live with them in a very secretive way, but the scars are not scars that people see on the outside. So interestingly, it's sometimes easier is not quite the right word, but society steps up for big T trauma. But for little t trauma, there's very little understanding of how it impacts a person, right? So what I talk about with attachment security is not big T trauma for the most part. We're not talking about Romanian orphans, Charles Nelson's book, Romanian
I
Orphans.
heard about these stories, yes.
We're talking about children who are deeply emotionally neglected, but have a roof over their head and food to eat, but develop narcissistic personality disorders and eating disorders and alcoholism and drug because they have suffered little t traumas. So the question is not, is therapy necessary and is therapy causing this? But what has happened in society that has changed, that is causing more people to need therapy? So I'm going to disagree with this woman's book. I do believe that there's a lot of bad therapy, but I don't believe that therapy is causing the mental health crisis. I do believe that diagnosing people is not a good. So psychoanalysts don't do a lot of diagnosing.
Oh, you have this and that disorder, and you're on this spectrum and that spectrum and all that
We
stuff.
take the DSM, which is the book that has the diagnostic codes, and we're very light on it. If only put it on insurance forms just so our patients can get reimbursed. We don't focus. We're not like
procedure-based
psychiatrists.
billing.
Yeah.
You distort
Yes.
our
So
healthcare system in profound
I
ways.
put the mildest diagnosis because it doesn't matter to me. It's a person, and it's a person who suffered loss or suffered little t trauma or big T trauma, or a person who's having trouble adjusting to this wacky society we live in. So society has changed. It's become a much more complicated place to grow up in
Yeah,
and to live in.
no question.
So I would say that, so you want to say that people are more screwed up because of therapy? No, people are more screwed up because society is more screwed up. And so more people need help. So what do? We have to fix society, you know.
One of the things that I have found myself becoming over time is functionally more conservative. And here's what I mean by that. I'm going to give a definition. It's a pretty simple definition. It's like, oh, more or less the wisdom of your great grandparents was mostly right. So you could say traditional. I'm Catholic. I'm becoming more Catholic. I'm participating more. But it's like, oh, you know what? This 2,000-year-old tradition actually grappled with a lot of humanity for a long time, pretty rigorously. And I should probably not chuck it out the window, but pay close attention to it. And I don't know how much of that is just aging. I think some of it's literally just I'm getting older. But some of it is, I can feel, is a response to a world that is constantly lying about reality to me and to everyone around me and to my kids, maybe soon to be kids. And I think the question I have for you is, when you say that, you say we've got a crazy society, compared to what? What's the not crazy society?
So what we did is we're in the process of deconstructing society, all the institutions, all the structure. So society needs structure. We need structure and institutions like family, like faith, like gender. We need
Heresy.
Yeah, we need some structure. It could be that the structure we had was too rigid, and that's possible because we have to grow and we have to be flexible. But what's happened is it's like deboning a fish. All the bones were taken out of the fish. And that's a problem for society because all the institutions that held society, the glue that held society together, that made people feel safe. People feel safe in institutions. They feel safe in family. They feel, to a certain extent, unless you've been in a faith-based culture, it's possible. You can have trauma in a faith-based culture. So, I have people come to me and say, I can't believe you say that faith is good. I had a terrible experience. Growing up, I was I said, that's terrible. I feel for you. And I feel even more for you because faith could have been something so supportive, and it was turned into something so devastating and destructive, right? But we know that that's the minority, not the majority, that the majority of people, and the research shows this, that children who are raised in a faith-based family, it was a Harvard study done, do better in terms of their long-term mental health if they're raised with some faith, if they attend some religious services and their parents raise them in some faith. And that's because it's some structure, it's some, the idea, in my field, we talk about ethnocultural identity. We're trying to eliminate all identity that was part of structure, right? Religion, gender, ethnicity. We're trying to make everybody sort of like vanilla ice cream. Like everybody is fungible and generic, and
Well, it's
everybody's the
weird,
same.
right? Because we've got that, and then also hyper vigilance around really, really skin deep, literally identity at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a kind of like behavior is sandblasted into like a flat, plain, synthetic weirdo land. So you can do whatever you want, but what you are, that I can see from across the room, oh man, that's really important. That's the only thing we should be talking about, is what I can tell before you open your mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So that dynamic is very weird.
Well, that's when identity becomes calcified, and then you have xenophobia, and that's sort of what's happening too. I mean, but I think, to get back to the idea of structure, because that's the most important piece of this, is that institutions help people to feel safe in society. And we've removed all those institutions, right? Again, gender was an institution.
What does that mean when you say
Family is an
institution? Just how do you
structure, that there is structure.
So stable structure over time.
Stable structure that makes people feel that they belong somewhere.
You have been doing work around narcissism. And one of the things that seems to have risen dramatically, measurably, is we are becoming a more narcissistic society. I know there's this, what is it called? The Narcissism Index. I actually just took this recently, and I found my score went up a little bit from the last time I took it. So I was like, "Ooh, I don't know if I like that."
You'd say it went down, not up. Yeah. Anyway, yes.
Yeah. Well, there's like this curve that's like you want to be up here, but once you start to get down to the slippy slope, I don't know about that part.
Yeah.
Help me understand how you perceive what's going on with narcissism. We've talked about it last time, but it's worth revisiting what it really is and what drives it.
Well, we talked about feminism and how that affected society. I would say the two biggest movements that really deconstructed society were feminism and the Me movement. The Me movement of the 60s was basically a movement that said, I matter more than anybody else. Now, bad therapy, by the way, can promote that. So that's what I mean by there's good therapy and bad therapy.
Yeah,
good
I'm
therapy,
focusing on my
good
feelings all the
therapy
time.
is relational. Bad therapy is what you want and you need, and nobody else matters but you. Me, right? That's bad therapy, right? The idea is that that Me movement told people that individualism, that freedom to be you, freedom to be me was the most important thing. And that responsibility for relationships, for family, they no longer mattered, because what mattered was you, no one else. And what we know from development is that narcissism is a phase of development that all children go through. Children are born with a feeling of omnipotence. They have a feeling that they are the center of the universe, and that is critical to their development. If children aren't tended to in the beginning, which is a problem, because when we put our children in daycare, hand them over to other people, leave them at 6 weeks or 3 months, what we're not understanding is that for the first 8 months, a baby believes that they are the center of the universe and that you are an extension of them. So when you disappear, and you are no longer tending to them and providing them with security, they don't believe that their environment let them down. They take it on themselves and believe that there's something wrong with them from the very beginning. It is the beginning of diminishing a sense of self instead of raising it up. So for the first 8 months, babies need to be basically with the belief that their mothers are extensions of themselves. That's why mothers wear them on their bodies in other countries. They keep them close. At 8 months, babies say, right, you're separate. I now see you as a separate person. You could get up and leave me. Now I'm terrified. From 8 to 18 months, they go through something called separation anxiety, where they recognize that their mothers can leave. That's also a terrible time to leave them. But we know that this omnipotence and this sense of narcissism, to a certain extent, goes straight through adolescence, because adolescence is another period of narcissism. These are developmental phases. If a child is raised with sensitive, empathic nurturing and enough of their parents' physical and emotional presence, that child will move through that period and then become more empathic, more connected to relationships, more aware of others, right? What's happening is we are neglecting our children when they're very young because we're focusing on our own desires and our own needs, whether it's our professional desires or our own personal needs. Well, I want to go on vacation for a week. I'm just going to leave that baby. Well, no, if you leave that baby's going to be little t traumatized and is going to have issues when you come back. So this kind of sense that you can do anything you want and your children will be fine has created a generation of children who are neglected, emotionally neglected, because parents are choosing freedom over responsibility, freedom to be me over the fact that that child that you brought into this world did not elect to come into this world. That child is here because you brought them into this world, and therefore you bear responsibility for the emotional well-being of that child. And that child has irreducible needs. And so we have become a society that's very selfish. And that selfishness is generationally being expressed. We have 4 generations of narcissistic personalities. So meaning they never move out of that developmental phase. They get stuck, like getting stuck in a crack in the LP record. And what we know is that narcissism just means unhealthy defenses. So we have healthy narcissism and unhealthy narcissism.
Yeah, what's the difference?
Healthy narcissism is I'm smart, I'm talented, I'm likable, I'm lovable. That's healthy narcissism. Unhealthy narcissism are pathological defenses that you have to form as a very young child to cope with not being admired, acknowledged, understood, and having a parent who's present to do those things. And so then you develop what we call the defense of grandiosity and the defense of being okay without really being okay. We are sending our kids off into the world without the internal substance that we need to. Instead, we're sending them out just with almost a superficial sense of well-being, but not the substance to back it up.
What's the connection or relationship between unhealthy, excessive narcissism and empathy or lack thereof? How do they play?
So we're not born empathic. We're born just gimme, gimme, gimme. Again, we're born omnipotent. We're born with a sense of gimme, 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 I need, I need, I need. And healthy parents understand that that baby's not there to give to you. You are there to give to that baby. And straight through adolescence, that child is not there to give to you. You are there to give to that child. And so, that understanding that that child has needs, but does not yet have an experience of thinking about or feeling for others, that comes through modeling. If parents can self-sacrifice, can sacrifice for their children, can put their needs aside. So what I say is when you have a child, you don't give up your narcissism, your healthy narcissism. You lend it to your children.
That's neat.
And you get it back. But you model loving, giving, attentive, sacrificing behavior, that modeling is then internalized by those children. So it is environmental. It is not nature, it is nurture.
One of the things that I don't know how deep this research is, but in the boy crisis, it's referenced that there has been studies that children, and you're even into adulthood, who didn't have a father figure are less empathetic than those who have, which is weird at first blush because you think, well, like dad's sort of the rough and tumble, get out of the house, like the notion that the masculine role is important for the formation of empathy. Why that would be true is not immediately obvious. So are you familiar with this? And how do you understand what the causal relationship would be there?
So when you're an infant, empathy is based on mother's empathy. When you get to be a toddler and a school-age child, particularly if you're a little boy, a lot of your identity and your self-esteem is based on the acknowledgement, admiration, and recognition of your father. So men who have not had good relationships with their fathers, who have had absent fathers or negligent fathers or fathers. Interestingly, an abusive father is better than a negligent father.
Yeah. He cares enough to beat me.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying it's good, but
yeah, I get it
but
though.
those men who have not had the recognition, acknowledgement, and admiration of their fathers have a very hard time going forward, being able to recognize, admire, and feel for others.
So it's the experience of that selflessness that teaches us it.
Exactly.
I had thought that it could be something along the lines of that we might be on average more likely as men and as fathers to ask questions of our kids, something like this. Your kid comes home, they're crying, they got into some kind of fight. Mom, again on average, hugs, oh, I'm sorry, honey. And dad says, what did you do wrong? And forces you to think about somebody else instead of, like, because receiving attention doesn't seem like a lesson in empathy. It seems like a kind of experience of self-centeredness.
Actually, it's paradoxical because unless you get it, you can't give it.
That makes sense. It's this this role of attachment that we talked about in our last conversation, our last episode, and that you're bringing up again here. It's so challenging to the current status quo.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's certainly the thing that you've said out there in the world that probably gets you the most slings and arrows. Can it be overcome when it wasn't there?
Yes.
How?
I mean, so there are always scars, right? So can it be repaired? The answer is yes. Some things cannot be repaired. It depends on how deep the damage is, right? But attachment disorders are repairable, but the only way that they're repairable is not through CBT therapy, is not through drugs, is through an emotionally reparative experience with a therapist who redefines for you what a relationship is. If you've never known a loving, sensitive, empathic, attuned, acknowledging, admiring, understanding relationship, then you go forth in the world, one, without a trust of your environment, but two, without the belief that it exists, right? And so it's only by having a relationship. And so I say to people, be careful of wishing for miracles, because if you go to a CBT therapist, I mean, they may give you some tools, but it's a little like, cutting the grass. It might help you, but you're going to have to keep using those tools, and it's symptom relief. It doesn't really get to the root of the problem. Somebody gives you a pill, maybe it'll help you, maybe it won't, but it's not really getting to the long-term sort of root of the problem. The root of the problem is that relationally something went wrong for you that has to be repaired. The only way you can repair relational damage is to have a relationship.
There seems to be a foundation in trust, like trust but verify, and therefore you learn to trust.
Mm-hmm.
It's something like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like where before, when you meet people who are that don't trust anyone, um, it's they've been given good reason not to usually,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're stuck in that posture, like I'm not going to trust anybody. You can be obviously too trusting. Is there uh, if you're getting into a relationship with someone, a romantic relationship with someone who's got trust issues,
Mm-hmm.
are there ways to navigate that to help not, if it's like this is someone that they have these trust issues, but you love them, you want to be with them, and they're surfacing in a bunch of different ways. Do you have any advice for that, for how to deal with being in a relationship with someone who maybe didn't have their parents, and and has this lack of trust, lack of stability at their core?
Trust issues express themselves in different ways. You can have trust issues by rejecting loving relationships, avoiding. You can have trust issues by clinging desperately and being excessively dependent. So trust issues come in different forms. But as I said, attachment disorders, those trust issues are treatable, but you have to go into the kind of therapy that really understands the root of that trust issue. And so that means going to a psychoanalyst or a psychoanalytically oriented therapist. They might do therapy with you and not psychoanalysis, but you're really you're having to delve into what went wrong in your childhood and people say, oh, I don't want to talk about my childhood. And I say, well, I can't help you then, because if we can't understand, there's a saying that if you don't understand the past, you don't know who you are in the present, and you certainly aren't going to know who you are in the future or where you're going, right?
There's this sense of understanding, which is like cognitive. It's in your mind. It's working things out with your rational thinking. There's this other piece of the puzzle that I'm curious about, which is sort of I think that one definition of a character from Aristotle is something like your actions create your habits, and your habits create your character, and your character creates who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's, if you take that as like a truism, then establishing good habits, even if you don't want to do them, even if they're uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
seems like a really good place to start. There's like Jordan Peterson, make your bed every morning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how important is that behavioral, and I'm not saying cognitive behavioral therapy, I'm just talking about the behaviors of life, the choices you make, and that we often self-sabotage, and we don't do the things we know we should be doing, or we do the thing we know we didn't want to do. What's your advice for fixing the habits that build your character over time?
Well, we are our choices for sure, or at least a collection of our choices. But remember that, again, trust is something that is shaped and sculpted very early. And that's what we really don't talk about. That if you want to have children who can have loving relationships and are resilient to the bumps and the adversities of life, then you have to raise them with a certain amount of trust. And trust is formed in the very early days, with that baby being able to trust that you will be there for them when they are most vulnerable. And, we disregard that. And so trust is at the cornerstone of character. Because, yes, I suppose you could say you could be too trusting. I don't know that you can be too trusting. You can be so trusting that you are blind to adversity, I suppose.
Yeah, blind to warning signs that maybe
But I would
someone's,
rather raise a
yeah.
child who's too trusting than a child who's not trusting enough, right? But again, those, you call them disorders of trust, which are basically attachment disorders, can be treated. And that's really important because it gives hope to people. But I would say that if you're in a relationship with someone who seems to have an attachment disorder, either because they're very clingy or they are very avoidant, I wouldn't marry them unless they get some therapy. And I would make sure that they're treated before you commit to them and that they're committed to changing. Because living with someone who has an attachment disorder for a lifetime is a very painful thing for you, for your children.
One of the things that seems to happen is that the narcissist can get into and I've heard from folks who've said, oh, my father was a narcissist or my mother, and I'm the receiver of that, or that sometimes a symbiotic relationship between a narcissistic persons and people who are, I'm not sure what the right word is, but do you understand what I'm getting
Well,
at this?
like levels of water meet is the expression I always like to use, that
Yeah.
narcissists are attracted to narcissists because they match. We have to match with the people that we're with. And so what can happen is narcissists get together, but then one starts to be unhappy with that and develop and go to therapy. And then you have one who's still very much in that narcissistic state and one who's trying to move out of it, and they're no longer a match. So people match, right? And so, yeah, that's what I would say. Narcissists are drawn to other narcissists.
We live in this world that we've got. We have inherited the world we've been born into. And it's got a lot of tough stuff to confront. We've been talking about a lot of it. Not at the individual level, but at the larger scale. What are some of your ideas for things that would set up American culture to be more healthy from a psychological, behavioral, relational perspective?
Well, I mean, not to be a broken record, but that we look at the way we raise our children and we start to really be self-aware about our own self-centeredness, because I think at the core of what's happening with society is that everybody is in their own self-centered silo, and we're not functioning as a community or in a communal world anymore. We're functioning in an individualistic world. We're functioning in a world that demands things like independence and self-sufficiency, and those all sound like good words. Independence, doesn't that sound like a good word? Doesn't everybody want their children
We've got
to
a
be
pretty good
independent?
we've got a good declaration
Yeah,
of it,
yeah.
right?
But actually, you don't want your children to be independent. You want your children to be interdependent. You want your children to be relational, to be able to love and be loved. When you have a child, the first thing you think is, God, I hope this child is loved and can be loved, right? That's all you want for your children. If you're dying and your children aren't attached or married, I've treated some adults whose parents are dying and they're like, please get married. Please marry your boyfriend. Just marry them before I die. Because the idea that you would die before your children are either loved or being loved, right? Or loving or being loved. So, and I think we forget that the most important thing in life is relationships. It's more important than materialism. It's more important than high career achievement. It's more important than pretty much anything else. And so we forget that, and we don't teach our children that. We teach our children that they should be highly educated, and again, of a certain class, that they should make lots of money, that they should, get the gold ring. What we don't tell them is that the most important thing in life, Aristotle said, on your deathbed, who's going to be sitting beside you? Your boss who made you rich and gave you a promotion? Is it going to be, who's going to be sitting beside you? Is it going to be your stockbroker, or is it going to be your children and your partner, your spouse, who love you, who send you off with love and admiration and respect? And I think that society is going in the wrong direction.
One of the other pieces of the puzzle that's sort of been embedded in our conversation is marriage. Because we can talk about
Another
fathers
institution that we've lost.
in a major way. We can talk, and one of the things, so, I started us off asking about how you deal with the pathologies going on with young men. One of them is disillusionment. Again, not for everybody, but disillusionment with marriage as an enterprise, as an institution, as a thing that you should want to do. this is in this sort of red pill movement, the sense that, oh, the family courts are rigged against you. You're going to lose your shirt in a divorce. They catastrophize all these disaster situations. Oh, 50% of marriages end in divorce. Why should I bother? What a terrible bet to make on your life. Um, how, how do you think about, I mean, you're married, you have kids. How do you think about what has happened to marriage and how we should think about marriage, it, as part of our lives?
Well, so what we know from the research is that children do better when their parents are married in loving, healthy marriages. That doesn't mean that they stay together under the worst circumstances, which is intractable conflict. I have a book coming out in a year. It's called A Parent's Guide to Divorce. And I wrote it because so many children are destroyed by divorce.
Yeah.
Now, divorce doesn't have to destroy children. It's not good for children, but it doesn't have to destroy children. And it is destroying children because of the very self-centered, narcissistic way in which people divorce. So, is marriage important? Yes, very important. And it's another institution that's being deconstructed, right? So we know that when I mentioned family, I guess I should have said marriage, but yes, marriage is very important, primarily because two parents are better than one. And why is that? The English say an heir and a spare. They serve different functions. Fathers and mothers serve different functions. And even with gay couples who are together, generally they'll take different roles, not always. And if they don't, I advise them to, because you can't have two fathers or two mothers. You need a mother and a father role. So, but the idea that different functions are served by the sensitive, empathic, nurturing role and the encouraging resilience and playful tactile stimulation, that role of encouraging separation. The attachment and the separation roles are different.
The worrying that you're going to fall out of the tree and the being excited that you climbed that high.
That's right. And you need both. You need the encouragement to explore, and you need the, oh, honey, I'm so sorry you fell, come and get a hug. And you need both, right? And so marriage provided that. Marriage also provided the security, and this sounds crazy, that if something happened to one of your parents, you still had another, an heir and a spare. And that's a strange thing to say, but kids of a certain age, young children, will often say, what if you die, mommy? And then mommy goes, well, I'm not going anywhere, but if something happened to me, you have your dad.
Right.
Or what if something happens to daddy? Well, I'm here for you, honey. And so there was security, strength in numbers. There was security in having two parents and having all their extended family. And what's happening is that there's this fetishizing of having children alone. It's so bizarre. Men and women, not just women. Men are going out and getting eggs and getting surrogates, sometimes
Really?
heterosexual men, but a lot of gay men going out and saying, I want a child. And going
Like
out.
it's a toy you can buy.
Right. Buying a child because you have to pay for the surrogate and whatever. And that's a very controversial thing to say, but that's essentially what it is, saying, I want to be a parent. And what they do in doing that is they're fetishizing the idea of isolation, loneliness, raising children without the kind of support that marriage and families provide, which has always provided children with a lot of security. So, yeah, it's part of the deconstructing of society that's destroying society and making people feel very insecure. If you want to know what's happening with the mental health crisis, we have a world where people feel very insecure. And it's not just because of climate change or political, turmoil. It's because emotionally they don't feel rooted. They don't feel rooted in anything. We used to feel rooted in family, rooted in faith, rooted in the idea that I'm a woman, I'm a Jewish woman, I'm a Christian man. We're losing things that rooted people.
One of the things that and I don't know what the numbers look like because I've heard that actually our mobility has declined. But it seems like over the longer span of human history that we have generally lived in multi-generational environments where
Mm-hmm.
we are with our parents, our grandparents. Now, I say this with a feeling of a tinge of true guilt because when I actually moved to Texas, my parents are in Pennsylvania. I don't get to see them nearly enough. That was a choice I made. It has been good for my family, but this has been a cost I've paid of not
Mm.
being close to my parents. I talk to them multiple times a week. A friend of mine, Dan Buettner, did this big international study called about the blue zones, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the things he noted is that these regions, which he called blue zones, that had the
Mm-hmm.
longest lifespans, the most number of what's the term for centenarians, 100-year-old people, centenarians. That's not the
Yeah.
word. Um, they lived in multi-generational families.
Yeah.
That like Okinawa, Sardinia, all these different places, these towns. There's a town in Pennsylvania, very Italian Catholic town. It's declining. How do you understand the importance of multi-generational community in both the healthy like healthy psychology, and how much do you think that isolation has played a role in what's wrong with our society today?
You should have Mark Friedman on your show. Mark Friedman wrote a book called How to Live Forever about the loss of multi-generational living and extended family and what it's done to society, why grandparents used to raise their children and it helped them live a long time, and why they should do it again. The idea is that loneliness and lack of purpose mean we die sooner. And what we've done is we've created a society that's sort of like, you could say, like the Eskimos, like the Inuits, right? Where we ship our old people off and send them to Florida, or they chip themselves off and go to Arizona and Florida and say, I'm going off to my retirement community. Those retirement communities were the death of society, really. It was real estate developers' concoction. We're going to develop communities where old people can go and be adolescent again and be free and have no responsibilities.
And get higher rates of STDs than the general population too.
Meanwhile, they didn't live as long because they were lonelier. Sure, they had friends until their friends started to die. They had some friendships, and then their friends died. And then they realized they had most older people don't have friends who are much younger. They rely on their family for that, but their family now live far away. And so they have the loneliness aspect and they lose purpose. Once you stop working, I don't recommend anybody retire who's listening to this podcast, particularly men, because their sense of self is very much tied to their meaningful work. Freud said you need love and meaningful work. And if you don't have meaningful work of some kind, you are going to die sooner. I shouldn't say that exactly, cause and effect, but pretty much.
It's
Meaningful work, having purpose is very important to living a long time. And so when we lose our work, so, in the old days, you would have, you quit the bank and you got the 50 years, you got the gold watch and you quit your job. But now
you
you
broke
were
in like a year.
now you were a grandfather, and now you took your grandson out for fishing every Saturday, and you picked him up from school on Wednesdays and took him to his little league practice. And in a small town, that's what a grandfather did. A grandmother was there helping with the babies and cooking soup, and there was purpose in caring for others, in being sacrificing. And so in convincing all these old people to go and live in these communities, they separated families, right? We talk about how slavery separated families. Nobody talks about how these retirement communities separated families.
Well, in fairness to the guys building them, guys and gals building them, it's voluntary, right? So it's more complex than just building the buildings,
you
isn't
could
it?
say that, but marketing is not voluntary, and they marketed the hell out of it, right? And so you could say, is it voluntary if you market?
What do you mean? What do you mean marketing is not
They
voluntary?
marketed when they developed it. Read the book. It's really interesting. I think you'd like this book. He talks about the development of these these communities.
Do you think that marketing is a form of coercion?
It is, absolutely.
Really?
It's manipulation, absolutely. What do you think in advertising firms, they always have psychology, masters in psychology.
Oh,
They're
for
all
sure. I
psychologists.
came out of advertising.
It's manipulation.
But how is it, this is, I'll push on this. Because we're surrounded by it, right? I mean, this
Yeah.
is it, like, and so I would say there's a truth in that sense, in that we are in part the product of the stories and the messaging we get.
Yeah.
But what's the difference between advertising and any other form of persuasion, including this conversation we're having right now? I think advertising gets kind of a bad rap from a lot of quarters.
If advertising can market good things too. I mean, you can have positive manipulation, but I don't think encouraging people to leave their families and move to other parts of the country was positive manipulation. And what happened is people started to move, and then you had no friends. All your friends were going to Florida or to Arizona.
Especially if you're here in New York, man.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah. And so then you were alone. Then you were lonely, right? Then you lost your community. And one of the things that is important as you age is sense of purpose and not being lonely, but friendships. Friendships are very important. So if all your friends were moving to these retirement communities and no one stayed around your town anymore or was raising their grandchildren, you lost your community. So you had to go where your community was. So they convinced people that it's better to move away from your children and your grandchildren. So people lost their purpose because now they no longer had meaningful work that was paid labor. They were retired, right? They weren't in their engineering jobs or their construction jobs or their law jobs or whatever jobs they had. Their meaningful work then would have been to be responsible. So responsibility is a very healthy thing. It's very healthy to have responsibility. When we don't have responsibility, well, we can have too much responsibility and then be stressed, but responsibility is a very healthy thing for human beings. So they lost their purpose. And when they lost their purpose and their community started to die, and now they were isolated and lonely, and then they died sooner. So the idea is extended family, living close to your family, raising your children near your family is not only for you and your children, it's also for your parents.
I take solace in the fact that my sister and my two niece and nephew live 10 minutes away from my parents. And if that wasn't the case, I don't think our current situation would be tenuous. I would probably feel compelled we have to move back, or we have to convince them to move to Texas,
right?
Somehow.
Or maybe they would move to you. But the point is,
it's like, I'll buy you a house.
that you're together. I think the point is that you're together. That grandparents who care for their grandchildren are happier. There's a study to show that grandparents, and there are outliers because, again, this rise in narcissism where grandparents are going, I don't want to help I did that. I'm not doing that. And that was never a thing.
No.
There was pleasure in watching your grandchildren grow, in watching your children grow old. There was pleasure in it. There was pleasure in nurturing your children to nurture your grandchildren. There doesn't seem to be the kind of pleasure in the responsibility anymore.
So, we've talked a lot about norms. We've talked a lot about some of these dichotomous and complementary relationships.
Yeah.
Something that I've gotten more vocal about on this show and has played a role in our politics and is impacting our kids in ways that seem pretty dramatic in terms of self-identification is gender fluidity and transgenderism. And this first of all, the notion that there can be trans kids, which I think shouldn't be taken for granted as a thing, that's just said like, oh yeah, trans kids. But that as a parent, I'm supposed to affirm very early, sometimes even down to like toddlers, confusion about my gender. Now, how do you think about this issue? What is your advice for a parent who has a boy or a girl who is presenting in certain ways, and then you're getting all this weird feedback about what you're supposed to do.
Hmm.
What's your take on this issue? Because I've got a super old school take that's like, no, that's nonsense. I'm just going to say that. But that doesn't help you if your kid is going through this. So for the viewer who actually has a kid that's that's struggling with gender identity, what should they do? How should they think about this?
So I have a different take on this. All children are gender confused. Babies are born genderless. And it's not until toddlerhood that they start to identify with one parent or another, or show boy-like behaviors or girl-like behaviors. So, but even going into the school years, boys can be more feminine and girls can be tomboys and be more masculine. And there has always been, should I say, a spectrum for girls and boys, always. It didn't need to be labeled or diagnosed or acted upon. It was just known that children fluctuate in their adopting feminine characteristics and masculine characteristics throughout childhood and even adolescence. So we've done a disservice to children by needing to label it. So there's the labeling again, there's the diagnosing and labeling it.
It's science now because we've given it a name.
Well, it's not science according to certain therapists like myself. I think it's, I think it is, there's a pressure in the mental health community to agree, and I don't agree with the way that we treat children who are struggling with gender identity, because all children struggle with gender identity. A lot of what's happening is adults projecting onto children. Now, not in all cases. I mean, there are some cases organically where you see a little boy at a very young age, very effeminate, like you would say that little boy is in a little girl's body. And you can see that. It's very rare.
Why aren't they just gay? Aren't they just gay?
Yeah, they could be, but in the old days, maybe they would be. But we have to now put a stamp on it, put them in a box, label it, and that then puts them on a track, puts them on a conveyor belt, and off we go. Because now you've been labeled. I think all labels put people on conveyor belts. I have people who come to me and say, I'm bipolar. My psychiatrist has me on medicine, I'm bipolar. And as I explore it more with them, I find that they have emotional regulation issues because they had a terrible childhood with probably a borderline mother who never could teach them how to regulate their emotions. But the label was stamped on them at an early age, and down the conveyor belt they go. So it can happen in any kind of situation. So we are stamping children, putting them in boxes, and then treating them accordingly. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake that we are allowing children to make permanent bodily changes before they're adults because their judgment is so impaired, because they shift so much in their moods, in their identities. It's a constant fluctuation of identity, right? I'm Christian, I'm an atheist. I'm an environmentalist, I'm a Republican. There's a constant fluctuation in children. And so rather than just allowing them to fluctuate without having to label them or put them in boxes or putting them on the conveyor belt where they are going towards permanent changes and permanent boxes. So there's an anxiety in society right now that we have to put children in boxes. And that's a shame for me, because for the most part, the majority of children that are being kind of put in these boxes and labeled and being aggressively treated for these disorders, in many ways, those children might developmentally even outgrow some of that fluctuation if allowed to. But there's so much vigilance about it that it's doing a lot of damage to children.
It came on the scene so rapidly. It was like slow and then sudden that this became something that you were encountering all over the place.
Mm,
What do you attribute that to?
mm,
Because I mean, it really, well, I remember I have a friend who transitioned in like the 50s or 60s. It's real, like a,
mm,
male to presenting as female. Uh, and, um, and it's an economist. And I had a bunch of conversations with this person because I was like, help me understand this. But this was not going, it was like 5 years ago. And it was like not even remotely the scale of the conversation and the cultural, Jaguar just did a really ridiculous and kind of pathetic ad campaign about rebranding. And it's just this gender androgynous soup ad.
mm,
There isn't even a car in it. It's like, how about a car? How about
mhm,
instead of the guy dressed like a girl, how about a car?
mhm.
What do you attribute that to? That culture shift that's really like aggressive culture shift. And do you think we're coming through the other end of it now?
I think it was rebellious. It was a rejection of structure. It was rebellious. And rather than just saying, okay, this is teenagers being and young adults being rebellious. I mean, again, there have always been transgender people or people that cross-dressed or identified as the other gender, always. I don't know, this may be politically incorrect, but if you remember Saturday Night Live, do you remember Pat
Yeah, oh yeah, of
in
course.
the 80s? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I may get really, slammed for mentioning Pat, but Pat was an example of there were always people who didn't quite
Androgynous.
fit into a box, but they were a very small minority, and they still are a very small minority. So it's a little bit of tyranny of the minority, which I think is sort of what's happening with the victimization. Tyranny of the minority, the rise of the individual over communal interests. So is it good for all children to be taught about transgender because there's one child in a class of 20 children who's struggling? We accept all. But do we want to introduce the confusion to all of those children developmentally? And the answer is probably not. So it's the rise of the individual. It's the same kind of thing we've been talking about, the rise of the individual over the community and what the communal interests are. So we want to accept everyone, right? So a lot of those kids who were, oh, hard to figure out in terms of their gender in the 70s or the 80s or whenever, those kids got teased, they were marginalized, and that wasn't fair. And so you'd say, right, the awareness that people are different, that people can be different in many ways, and that we accept all people, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their religion, whatever their whatever identity they are. That's different than proselytizing and teaching these things to very young children who are developmentally not prepared to handle this kind of education because they're not actually developmentally capable of handling a talk about gender confusion. So, do we want to accept the minority? Of course we do. Do we want to elevate them to a level that it's taking front and center of the conversation? No. And that's what we've done. We've allowed it to sort of preoccupy us, to sort of dominate the conversation. And there are a very small percent of people in this country. So we want to accept, but we also don't want to proselytize. And that's what's happening.
The this has I have some nephews who are going through medical school,
Mhm.
and this gender ideology has permeated the medical schools to some
Mhm.
degree. They're
Mhm.
like in the Midwest, going to a state school in the Midwest, and we were all together for Christmas last year, and they're like, "Oh, it's super woke. Everybody's saying their pronouns. It's all crazy." Medical school. It's like this is so. It's like, I guess, did you flunk biology then? I don't understand the institutional embrace. I mean, I think I do, and I think it sounds a lot like everybody else that talks about this, which is just like sort of academic radicalism run amok and echo chambers.
Mm.
Um, but even so, it's like, this has been like the break point for, I think, a lot of people, myself included, where it's like the bridge too far. It's one thing to be talking about radical economics, but you're like attacking the foundational human reality of our being, our biological being.
Well, again, undermining the structure of society that keeps society together, the glue that holds society together. You start to take the glue out and society falls apart, which is what's happening.
It seems like that's the intention.
Right.
Do you
Deconstructing.
think that would you say that there is an actual active vision of social reform that is fundamentally revolutionary that's underneath all of this?
I think there's an angry, rebellious nature to it, which is, we're going to burn it all down.
Yeah.
And so, and burning down the structure of society is not what we want to be doing. We want to reform society. We want to make it better. We don't want to burn it down. We want to renovate. We don't want to burn it down and have to build a new one, because it took thousands of years to build this one.
So this is more of a philosophical question, which is, at any given moment, there is the norm and there's the fringe.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, that shifts and changes. And the question for the person that wants to struggle with this, what is the truth? What does justice actually mean? Do you have a vision or a way you think about when change is no longer appropriate? Like because there is a kind of, it is, I think, the progressive impulse to say, well, you're never done changing. It's like, well, what point are you never done changing? Well, we've now got gender equality to the point that women are outperforming men in just about everything except maybe STEM and construction. Okay, so are we done then? Aren't we done? It's like, well, no, now we've got to deconstruct what a woman even is. I think we were done before this, but do you have a frame for that? When should we stop? When is enough enough?
People are playing God, because if you're a person of faith, you'd say biologically it's taken thousands of years to create human beings in the form that they're in. And we come with a structure, a makeup, hormones that impact our behavior, our nurturing behaviors. As far as I know, there aren't any men that are giving birth or breastfeeding children.
How dare you?
And probably, hopefully never will be. But the idea is that to deny some of the basic biological sort of truths, the inconvenient truths that it's taken thousands of years to develop as we are as humans. And we're not going to change it all up in 75 years. Or, and the change is happening, as you say, so quickly. So you can't deny the reality that women give birth to children, that they produce certain hormones that affect their nurturing behaviors, or that men have certain nurturing behaviors. And in a way, a lot of the depression and anxiety may very well have to do with suppressing a lot of those behaviors. I see that postpartum has gone up. Postpartum depression has risen dramatically in this country, to the extent that some of the figures I read are 30% of women suffer
30%?
Suffer from postpartum depression. It was 20%. I think it's more like 30%. And what's that about? And what it is about is that we're denying women their natural instincts to want to nurture their children. We're creating conflict for them. So where does depression come from? It can come from trauma, from your own childhood. It can also come from too much stress and conflict. We've created so many conflicts for women who feel pulled in two directions, right? We've created conflicts for men who feel pulled in different directions. Aren't I supposed to be a man, but now I'm supposed to be more like a woman? And so that creates depression and anxiety. So as I said earlier, therapy is not creating the mental health crisis. Society is creating the mental health crisis, and we need to train more therapists to cope with it while trying to change society.
We haven't talked about social media or some of the other things, but social media and just digital devices and
Mm-hmm.
connectivity. Jonathan Haidt, who we both know,
Mm-hmm.
that's he's dying on that hill to some extent with
Mm-hmm.
what he's
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
focusing on now. How do you think about what should be done about social media, both at the individual level, like as a parent?
Mm-hmm.
When should we give our kids a phone from your perspective? And do you support some of these efforts to legally, like Australia, I think is contemplating banning social media apps for kids. My libertarian streak is not a big fan of that kind of thing. But what's your take on
So I was
where we
just
should
in
go?
Australia speaking for ARC. So yeah, I know about that. Jonathan Haidt is correct in saying that social media is damaging to children. And the smartphone is, Gene Twangy was the one who came up with the idea of the smartphone being bad for children.
Yeah,
It's
hi
really the
Jen.
smartphone that's bad for children. That was the beginning. So even before social media, having to be constantly connected and to have no sense of independence or separation didn't allow you to develop a sense of security being separate from contact with your parents or contact with everyone, right? It didn't allow for aloneness ever, right? I mean, you remember what it was like before the smartphone. We
I
had
can
a sense of
feel the
being alone.
change. I can feel the change in myself. I
Yeah.
can feel the like way that I am dependent on checking things and it's
Yes, and
and struggle
and
to
that's
maintain
not social
focus.
media. That's your emails, that's your texts,
It's
that's your
all of it.
phone. It's the
Notifications.
constant contact that doesn't allow the space that human beings need. They need space from social contact. Even babies, if you see the way that babies interact with adults, they connect, and then when they're overwhelmed and they're done, they disconnect. They
Yeah,
look
they
away.
get overstimulated.
Yeah, they look away.
Yeah.
And then when they're ready to reconnect, they reconnect. But then they look away and they do their own thing again, right? We need that as human beings. We need breaks. We need social relational contact, but we need breaks. The smartphone took away the breaks. And that really was the beginning of the downfall. So if you want to say technology in terms of the smartphone really was damaging to people's mental health. Now add social media, which provided mostly teenagers, but adults too, with a
Yeah.
perfectionistic view of the world, a competitive perfectionistic view of the world, constant stimulation, constant overwhelming stimulation that then triggered these dopamine reactions. So what we know is that if you overload a child's dopamine receptors when they are under the age of 14, and I've heard statistics to say under the age of 16. I just think
I,
Jonathan was trying to mitigate it and
oh,
make it easier for
I would agree.
parents to swallow, but I think it's 16.
That sounds more right to me.
Because under
Yeah.
the age of 16, if you start to drink alcohol or smoke marijuana or do drugs or gamble or look at porn or get a smartphone, you are more likely to become addicted to it. That is what the research says. Whereas if you wait till you get your adolescent past early adolescence, into middle adolescence, towards the end, towards late adolescence, you are more likely to see social media as an adversity, as something to be regulated, but not something that you are obsessive over or addicted to. Because once you get the dopamine going at such an early age, the brain becomes used to it and used to being stimulated by it, and then can't function without it. And it's very, very difficult for a child who's been exposed to marijuana under the age of 16 to withdraw from marijuana. Very hard once they start drinking before 16. So, I always encourage the kids that I treat, you can
What about Italy
experiment.
and Spain and France? They're like drinking. Is it a toxicity as a function of dose when it comes to the alcohol?
There is a lot of controversy about that. Basically, they microdose their kids with wine. So in other words, they'll allow their children, if you go to
They have a
Italy, they
little
don't
bit.
allow their children to drink a
No.
lot. They'll give their children this much wine with dinner.
They have the lowest rates of alcoholism in Europe too.
Yeah, they don't have a culture of excessive drinking. They use wine as a condiment to food. They don't really have a culture of alcoholism. We have a culture of obsessiveness in our
Yeah.
culture. So, and if you expose children to excessive drinking, excessive marijuana smoking, then they're more likely to become addicted. So social media is no different. So if we can keep smartphones and social media out of the hands of kids, give them a flip phone. I sat down at a conference with a Google executive who, she was in charge of making Google phones safe for children, creating Google phones. And I said, you've got to do something. She said, we have. She said, we have a phone. We've had a phone for years. The grown-ups don't want to buy it for the kids. We marketed it and they don't want to buy it. So now I'm thinking, well, now maybe it's doing better. And maybe because of Jonathan in his book. But the idea is that if you can keep smartphones and social media away from your children until they're 16, there's a greater chance that they'll see it as something to deal with and an adversity, but not something that will bury them or drown them.
Do you think this is the interesting challenge of our times, that there's a lot of things about what works because we evolved in them and because they're natural, that are no longer, you don't need to do them anymore, and so now you have to do it consciously. And as somebody who doesn't want the government to do very much, if the government's not going to do it, we the people in civil society have to do it, which relies on a culture that supports that. So how do you think about on this issue in particular? So are you in favor of government regulatory action on this front, or is it like, that's going to go nowhere good? How do you think about it?
So I'm not a libertarian, but I also don't believe in excessive regulation, but I do believe in regulation. I do believe the government has a role to play in providing structure. So there's another structure. If a libertarian wants to deconstruct the use of government, it's not important. I think government is another institution that has its use and is important. Like family, like marriage, like faith, it has its use. It shouldn't be a and so what would that look like? There are some things that government regulating is helpful for. And in this case, I think that parents cannot be trusted to parent anymore. And that's a terrible thing to say. But I think
Putting the government in charge of
well,
that? I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
But I think by creating structures. So I treat parents who are drinking and drugging with their kids because they think it's a good idea to be peers with their children. Again, take the structure out. The authoritarian approach to parenting where parents are above children and have authority and power over them. This is part of what society is suffering with. So you're trusting parents to do the right thing. And I'm saying, I'm not sure I do trust parents to know what the right thing is.
I'm not saying I trust parents. I'm saying I don't trust voters any more than I don't trust parents. That's all I'm saying.
Right. So what could the government do? The government could say that that social media is illegal for children under the age of 16. That would be a start. They could say that they could put, I guess, warnings on smartphones and say buying your child a smartphone is hazardous to your child's health under the age of 16. In the end, parents can sneak social media, can sneak, I've seen parents sneak their children drugs and alcohol. Right?
Black markets happen.
Right. So you're trusting individual parents, and I'm saying sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. And so you need some structure in society and laws. Having said that, I think if you are of a libertarian approach, then you live in a community where people are like-minded with you, a religious community, It's been shown that if you live in a religious community, a Christian community, a Jewish community, where people have similar values, and you educate your children in the, but then what you're saying is people should live in shtetls again, should isolate, right? I mean, so essentially that's what it would mean to live in
To some
community.
extent,
Yeah,
perhaps.
but okay, so then you live in a community where people have similar values to you, and you say to all of the parents in your community, it's another way of going about it, you say, we're all going to agree not to give our children a smartphone or social media until they're 16.
I think this is actually happening in an emergent way, especially among the parents who have decided to homeschool.
Yes.
And to a greater extent in the aftermath of COVID, where you saw the school system being a barbaric parasite creature that it is. And so it's like,
And in religious communities.
yeah, and saying like, I'm out of this.
Yeah.
And then you find, and so my sister's now homeschooling her kids, and she's part of this hybrid academy, and she has built a community. And so she has
community of similar values.
Effects.
Yeah, a community of similar values.
I can let my son go to your house, and you can let your son come to my house, because we don't have the phones in either house. So It's not like I can have my rules, but then as soon as you go outside, the rules are out the door, which is the other part that's so hard as an individual parent.
But in a heterogeneous society, because that's talking about homogeneity of values, which is, you could say we used to live like that. You lived in small communities, and you had a group of people that had the same value system as you. But we live in a heterogeneous society with people of different faiths and beliefs and values and cultures, and that's both good and difficult, because that means you are thrown together, and your children are thrown together with children of other families with other value systems.
It's we're coming to the end of our time together. As you look ahead, as you look out into the landscape, are you optimistic or pessimistic about?
Very optimistic. I wouldn't do what I do if I was pessimistic. I would curl up in a ball and cry, because it's really upsetting what's happening. I'm part of this organization called ARC, the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, and I got involved because it's a doing organization. It's a solutions-oriented organization. It's given me a platform to go around the world and talk about these important issues. And so, no, I'm very optimistic. And, because people have the capacity to change. I wouldn't be a therapist if I didn't think that people have the capacity to change. They have to want to change. So you have to expose people to enough knowledge that they can make good choices for themselves and their families. But I believe that people have the capacity to change.
One thing that I think is, I believe it is fundamentally healthy and good as an outcome of the election. And you and I voted for Trump, with caveats, but lesser two evils for me. But I think one thing that I think is healthy, if you are a liberal-minded person, is that it seems like, at least right now as we sit here, you got like football players doing the Trump dance and stuff like that. You don't have to like Trump. I'm not saying you have to like Trump. But we should be able to live in a country where both sides can actually feel like they can celebrate when their political victory happens. Both sides. Not one side has the entire cultural milieu and the other side are fascists. Would you agree with that? Do you think we're in that respect? You can talk about whether you think Trump is good or bad if you want, but this isn't. I think there's a culture moment in this election, especially because the election was pretty thin on policy.
Yeah.
It does feel like there was a cultural mini reckoning that's taken place.
I think both sides are poor losers. That's what I really think.
I think that's not wrong.
One thing that you teach your children from a very young age is how to deal with disappointment and rejection and losing. It's actually more important to teach your children how to lose than how to win. You want to celebrate their wins and you want to admire them for their wins, but it's very important to help them to be able to accept their losses. And I guess we're in a society where, parents are not teaching children how to deal with losses, because neither party is very good at accepting losing. And we all lose sometimes.
That does drive all the way down to the individual, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. The just total discomfort. It goes back to the start of our conversation. If I don't ask her out, I won't lose. I won't face rejection.
That's right. And that's actually, self-esteem is based on, contrary to popular belief, self-esteem is not based on all the good things about you and all your strengths. It's equally based on your limitations. It's as much based on your wins as it is about your losses. And that's something that I think today, if you have a narcissistic parent, it's all about winning and it's all about your strengths and it's all about perfection. And the truth is, that's not what self-esteem is based on. It's based on a balance of our strengths and our weaknesses, our wins and our losses.
One of the things that is so interesting to observe in yourself, to me, is how little we know about what we're capable of ourselves. Like, you'd think, who knows me better than me? And yet we accomplish things that we don't think we can do, which is weird, because well, wait, how did I not know I could do that thing I did? And I think that lesson is so potent, because when you do that a couple times, it opens up the future in such a powerful way. But you have to overcome this first step, which is trying to do something that you don't think you can do. And I know, as a parent, this has been like at the foreground of my me and my wife's modus operandi is, let's make sure our son gets enough opportunities to see what he's capable of, even if he fails. Failure is actually almost sometimes the best outcome, because when you survive it, wow, I'm still here. Wow, oh, that class was hard and I got a D. But I'm still here. I'm alive. It didn't kill me.
Well, to take risks, you have to be able to deal with loss. That's the truth. You can't take risks unless you can deal with either outcome.
I asked you last time, I'll ask you again, because I ask at the end of every show. We call this Dad Saves America because I think it's a role we play, and I know you agree, that's really important as men. How do you think about your role in the American story?
Oh, that's a big question. My role in the American story is to educate people and influence people to think about things through a different lens, and to maybe think about some of those structures that we've thrown away, like throwaways, as really being positive and not burning down the house.
Erica Komisar, I think you might be our first return guest, and for good reason. Thanks for being on Dad Saves America again.
Thank you for having me.